The story of France under Nazi occupation in World War II is a complicated one, full of heroism and also moral squalor. And we're going to focus on the latter today in a really fascinating conversation with the historian Julian Jackson on the grim end of a great World War I hero of France, Philippe Pétain, who in World War II led the collaborationist Vichy regime, a historical moment that continues to echo in contemporary politics. Let's get into it.
It is a prescription for war, this Iraqi invasion of Kuwait.
December 7th, 1941, a date which will live in infamy.
The bloody experience of Vietnam is to end in a stalemate.
We continue to face a grave situation in Iran.
We shall fight on the beaches, we shall fight on the landing grounds, we shall fight in the fields and in the streets. We shall never surrender.
Hi, I'm Aaron McLean. Thanks for joining School of War. I am delighted to welcome to the show today Dr. Julian Jackson. He is the Emeritus Professor of History at Queen Mary University of London, author of numerous books to include the multi-prize winning Certain Idea of France, The Life of Charles de Gaulle, also the author of France on Trial, The Case of Marshal Pétain, which we're going to discuss today. Julian, thank you so much for joining the show.
It's a pleasure.
This is going to be a conversation really about Vichy France and France under occupation and the behavior of the French government during that period. And this one figure looms above it all, probably less well known, I'm guessing, certainly to American listeners, than Charles de Gaulle, the liberator of France, the leader of the Free French, and the previous subject for one of your books. Who was Philippe Pétain before the war? How does he come to prominence in France?
I'll answer that question, but begin it by saying that because he's now a non-person in France, because of the things we're going to be discussing, he's no longer a national hero, but he's a national villain. All the streets that used to be named after him have disappeared. The only Pétain streets you'll find in the world today are actually in the United States, curiously enough, because he was actually quite a hero for the American public in the interwar years. So he was a hero, above all, because he was France's greatest, he was possibly the most important of all the great First World War generals in any country. He was the man who was in charge of what is for the French the kind of quintessential battle of the First World War, the famous Battle of Verdun, where for a whole year in 1916, the French and the Germans sort of slogged it out. The Germans tried to take this fortress, and the French would take a bit back, and the Germans would take a bit more. And it was the bloodiest battle of the First World War, which in the end, the French won, if you can call winning, losing, probably 300,000 men. Same on the German side. So he's the victor of Verdun, firstly. But then secondly, he's also, or his reputation in the interwar years, is also as the general who really cared about the ordinary soldiers. Most First World War generals were seen as ready basically to sacrifice ordinary soldiers as cannon fodder, sending them across the trenches and so on. Pétain had a different reputation, and not unjustifiably so. And when in 1917 there was a wave of mutinies, really serious mutinies in the French army, which could have basically just meant that France was defeated, Pétain is brought in to put them to an end. And how does he put them to an end? Partly with stick, but also with carrot. He says, I understand we're not going to go on sending people on suicidal missions. We're going to give you better conditions, better leave, and so on. So out of the war, he comes out as the general who wins the emblematic battle, but who also is the general who cares for the ordinary soldier. So that's how he comes out of the First World War, with an extraordinary reputation. Then in the interwar years, he becomes more than that. He becomes a sort of national father figure, you could say. As the other First World War generals die off, and none of them had the same kind of extraordinary, legendary hold on the French people that Pétain has, gradually he becomes more than a military figure. He becomes, as I say, almost like a kind of savior in the waiting. And it has to be said that he quite likes this. He quite takes to the role of savior in the waiting. He's not necessarily a hugely intelligent man, but he has a few simple ideas about making society better. People should study more at school. They should be more patriotic. Pacifism is bad, etc. Simple ideas. Family is important. Conservative, simple, solid ideas. And in the 1930s, when France is in a really politically pretty bad way, there are endless turnovers of government. There's riots on the street in 1934. There's a lot of anti-parliamentary feeling. There are fascist movements and so on. Pétain becomes, for conservatives, the man who might be able to step in and restore authority, order, conservative values, and so on. So he's a military man, a legend, who is also going to increasingly take on a kind of political symbolism for people on the right.
I'm going to ask you to say a bit more about these pre-war or interwar French politics, because I think it's really hard to understand what Vichy is and what it means, and then what his legacy is, without understanding sort of what it comes from. The way you just sketched out how Pétain is sort of a savior in waiting suggests that even before the war, or implies that even before the war, there's sort of an extra constitutional quality to the way in which he might be a savior. Just say a bit more about these politics and the major currents and how Pétain weaves into them.
Yes, I went over that very fast, but I think what we've got, France is what was called, was a republic, like America is a republic. It was a republic with a very different political system from the one it has today. It was a republic. At the moment, France has a president whom everybody more or less knows because he's quite an important figure. That was the republic created by de Gaulle after the war, precisely because of what had happened in 1940. And in the interwar years, it was a parliamentary republic. The president had very little power, nothing like the American president. He was a sort of a kind of just sort of a symbol. It was said, that the role of the president was to open flower shows, but otherwise, keep his mouth shut and so on. So he has no real power. And there is enormous political instability. Governments come and go with amazing rapidity because of the nature of the political system. Now, that's worked okay. After all, the French got through the First World War with that system. So it's not necessarily that the system was fated. But what happens in the interwar years, in the 1930s in France, as throughout the world, is the impact of the Great Depression. And the impact of the Great Depression creates budget deficits, high unemployment, and so on, and an increasing sense among the French that this system is no longer adequate to be able to cope with the new problems of the modern world, you might say. So you get the development of so-called anti-parliamentary leagues. That's to say, movements which are kind of proto-fascist. Some of them wear uniforms, they march in the street, they shout anti-parliamentary slogans. I suppose the key date, and I have to say, just to give a kind of American comparison, if it's not inappropriate, when you had the famous event on the 6th of January, when President Trump, having been defeated, felt he hadn't been defeated, and there was the, whatever you want to call it, the demonstrations, the Capitol. For all French historians like myself, and including my French historian colleagues in the United States, we all thought one thing. We thought 6th of February, 1934, when in Paris there were similar riots for slightly different reasons, when it looked as if a crowd was actually going to storm Parliament, and the Parliament in Paris is on one side of the River Seine. Everybody, I'm sure, knows the River Seine runs through Paris. On one side, there's the Place de la Concorde, where the king was executed in 1793. On the other side is the Parliament building. The police are guarding this bridge. The demonstration turns quite nasty, and the police fire, and 15 people, whatever, are killed. And that is a dramatic moment in interwar France. It's like the beginning of a sort of latent civil war. And from that moment, French politics becomes dramatically divided, polarized, between those on the right who think politicians are corrupt, Parliament is weak, you need a strong man, and here let's think of Pétain again, and those on the left who think that France has just escaped fascism, and unless we're careful, is going to become fascist. And so there's a great movement to the left called the Popular Front, with the communists playing a big role. So without going into any more detail, because it becomes amazingly complicated, just think of a society which is on the verge of a kind of civil war of words, although there had been deaths, which can, in the right circumstances, explode into something much more serious. So that's the state of France in the 1930s.
So let's skip to the crisis then. Amidst this civil war of words and extraordinarily fraught politics, an actual war comes to France, and in the spring of 1940, France is defeated on the battlefield. Describe the circumstances into which Pétain emerges to summon France as a savior at this point, and signs this armistice with the Germans, thus setting into motion the events of the next few years in French politics. What puts him in the position to do that? And this is perhaps kind of a naive question, but it's a complicated moment for the French right, who detest, of course, their compatriots on the left, and as you describe it, seem to have some contempt for the liberals in the center as well. But the invading party, who's just killed a lot of French troops on the battlefield, and of course, as we know, is about to do even worse to the French people. Here they are at the gates. So what happens?
Well, if I can just give you a little motto or slogan to kind of give you some sense of how divided France had become in the 1930s, which will be a beginning of an answer to your question. There was a phrase that floated around in right-wing circles in 1939, 1940, and that phrase was rather Hitler than Blum. Now, what does that mean? Who was Blum? Blum was a left-wing socialist leader who'd been prime minister in 1936 as a reaction against the events I'm just talking about, the Popular Front government. And many people on the right were so antagonistic to the left, to a man like Blum, who was a Jew, there was a lot of anti-Semitism, who was a socialist, that this little motto, rather Hitler than Blum, well, are the Germans worse than the communists? Are the Germans worse than socialists? So that is floating around. I'm not saying that people wanted to be defeated, but that gives you a kind of background noise. Let's go to 1940. France is defeated catastrophically in 6 weeks. We don't need to look at the military reasons for that. Let's just accept the fact it happened. And when a defeat happens, people look for scapegoats and solutions. What is the solution? Well, one solution would have been, no one denied that in 6 weeks the French army was finished. One possible solution would have been to say, right, we're finished. The government, the official government, will go abroad and will continue to, as it were, be France abroad, and the army will, as it were, capitulate on the field. There'll be a surrender, but the France, in form of the government, will be abroad. And others said, no, that would be dishonorable. And anyway, Germany has now won the war, not just beaten France. So let's accommodate ourselves to that situation. That was the other view. Now, why is Pétain playing any role here? Because the Prime Minister, a man called Paul Reynaud, in 1940, had, when it looked as though things were really bad on the battlefield, he had called Pétain into his government. And he'd done it because what's better to have in your government than a great war hero? So he was brought in, as it were, for morale. What this man didn't know was that Pétain was pretty convinced, or not totally convinced, that it was all over and it was necessary to accept defeat and make the best of it. So a great debate happens in the government. Will we sign an armistice with Germany, say it's over, or will the government go abroad? Now you won't say, what does that mean? What that means is if the government goes abroad, France is still in the war, theoretically, obviously. And that does make a difference. If you sign an armistice, the government remains in France and sort of says it's over and the Germans are here and we'll do the best we can. Pétain was in the armistice camp. And the people who wanted an armistice, like Pétain, essentially were motivated by, I think, two ideas. One is the defeat was caused by the weakness of the politicians, by anti-patriotic propaganda, by the left. So we've got a chance now to remake France, a new France, a conservative France. And their slogan was the National Revolution. So we'll make a new France. Their second thought was, well, anyway, the war will soon be over. Britain will soon be defeated. So it makes sense to do some kind of deal with Germany, to do the best we can in this situation. So those are their two working assumptions. So an armistice is signed on the 22nd of June, 1940. And what are the terms of that armistice? Very briefly, basically, France is divided into two zones, a north, where Paris is, which is occupied by the Germans. So if any of your listeners have ever seen photographs of occupied Paris, you'll see swastikas everywhere. Whereas in the south, the so-called free zone, there were theoretically no German soldiers, and the government of Pétain set itself up in a little spa town in the center of France, where again, everybody knows because it's famous for the production of its water, that's to say Vichy. Vichy was well known for nothing else except water.
There's the soup.
Yeah, exactly. Spa, exactly, yeah. And what made it a good place for a government was there were lots of hotels. So all the different ministries could move in. And so one ministry, the foreign ministry took over the Hotel of Hotel de l'Angleterre, ironically. So you get this curious regime which sets itself up with its capital in Vichy, and the people around Pétain is the figurehead. But the idea is that we are going to, as it were, make a new France. We're going to introduce a national revolution. And let's summarize that national revolution in a slogan: travail, famille, patrie. Work, family, fatherland, as opposed to liberty, fraternity, equality.
Right. So one of the most interesting passages early in your book, which is really well written and creatively framed too, is this unfolding of the trial itself for Pétain after the war. And I really do recommend it to listeners. But you get into this question of, is the armistice itself a crime? Which is, of course, a major issue later. Through looking at it through the lens of these three different prominent I was going to say French men, but of course Simone Weil, a French woman. So Simone Weil, Raymond Aron, two prominent intellectuals of the 20th century, and then de Gaulle himself. De Gaulle, I'm probably going to mangle this, so you'll come in and correct me if I mess up my summary here, but de Gaulle of the view that the armistice itself is a criminal act. Aron more of the view that the real crimes began later, after Operation Torch, the fall of French North Africa, and the German occupation of the military occupation of the whole of France in late 42. That it's after that Pétain's guilt rises to a level of legal inescapable culpability. And then Simone Weil, who sort of is a very interesting figure, who I guess dies amidst the war in exile herself, who has a sort of vaguer notion of well, not the notion may not be vague, but this notion of sort of a vague collective guilt. The Pétain is, if there's guilt, Pétain is guilty along with the French people. And I want to maintain a level of imaginative sympathy to the extent I can, because of course, in the summer of 1940 or late spring of 1940, we don't, the people alive on June the 22nd did not know what was going to happen in 1941, 42, 43, 44. They couldn't be sure of the nature of what was to come. It's impossible. We, sitting here in 2025, know exactly what was going to happen. So I do want to retrain that shred of sympathy. Nevertheless, I do know what was going to happen. And so I naturally find myself sympathetic to the de Gaulle view. Help us understand this controversy over the legality of the armistice.
Well, unfortunately, you've summarized it so well, I don't have to say very much. But I think the point is, let's fast forward actually to 1945. The war is over. It has, France has been liberated. And there is a general sense, as always after, obviously there were the Nuremberg trials, which were the big trials that took place of German war criminals. You had the Tokyo trials and so on. So in every country which had been occupied, there has to be a kind of reckoning. The same thing happened, in some... or doesn't happen immediately, but does happen at some point. Whenever a regime falls, there has to be some kind of national conversation, if you want. And the trials about retribution, the trials about punishment of the traitors, but the trials also opening up, as it were, discussion about where we are now, where we're going to go. So there had to be trials, and the French call these the purges, the épuration. And that word épuration means purification. And it's quite the word therefore has this sense not only that you're punishing the guilty, but you're, as it were, purifying yourself by getting rid of the bad among you and creating a pure and new society looking forward. So a high court is set up to try the leaders of the Vichy regime. And obviously the leader of leaders is Pétain. But then the question does become, what is he guilty of? Now, with some people, it was just very clear. Some of the extreme people who joined were sort of ultra-right-wing organizations under Vichy and had carried out terrible atrocities against the resistance, against Jews, against free. No problem. I mean, they can simply be quickly dealt with. But what with Pétain, the problem is, in 1940, partly for the reasons you just said, no one knows what's going to come next. They know what's come before, and they know he's our hero. They don't know what's going to come next. So in 1940, we can say Pétain was unbelievably popular. I mean, de Gaulle was nothing. There was de Gaulle in London saying, I'm France. But de Gaulle was heard by nobody and known by fewer. Pétain was France in 1940 in some kind of sense. So the problem is, in trying him, you're trying yourself, as it were. The French are trying themselves, which is why I called my book France on Trial, because I think it's France talking about itself. And so at that point, you do get a lot of different views about what he's guilty of. You mentioned, I won't mention the names of the people again, but except to say that the three names you mentioned, de Gaulle, Raymond Aron, and Simon Weil, are all people who were totally against Pétain, but for different reasons. And there were so many things you could say he was guilty of, but yet different people didn't think that all the things were necessarily crimes. Let's just take de Gaulle. De Gaulle said, there's no question, as you said, signing the armistice was the crime of crimes. We could have gone on fighting from abroad. But Raymond Aron, who was a Jewish philosopher, intellectual who went to London, was at de Gaulle's side and so on, who had no truck with Vichy, said, no, I don't agree. The armistice was necessary to something that our fighting had to stop. There had to be some kind of provisional administration in France to deal with the situation. Pétain's crime was when, as after Torch and after the Allies were in North Africa and after the Germans, as a result of that, had occupied the southern zone, there's nothing left. At that point, he should have said no. Other people had other reasons, other things, as it were, for which he was guilty. And the most obvious other one was what happened on the 22nd of October 1940, when Pétain met Hitler at a little town called Montoire. And there was a famous photograph of their meeting, the handshake and so on. And that photograph of the handshake between the great French war hero and Hitler caused a shock in France. You'd say, well, why such a shock? It's such a shock because, remember, France has signed an armistice, but France has not signed a treaty with Germany. The war is still going on. So this is shaking the hand of the enemy. But Pétain followed that up by saying, I assume my act, and I am now ready to enter down the road of and the word he used, the C word comes out, collaboration. Collaboration. So signing the armistice could be not the decision, the fact he stayed on after November 1942, shaking Hitler's hand, not just shaking his hand, but the policy that represented. Or a fourth thing, was his crime none of these things, but the fact that he had used the situation basically to abolish parliament and install an effective dictatorship. Or fifth thing, which wasn't much talked about in 1940, and I'm sure 45 at the trial, and I'm sure we'll come back to that, was it the persecution of, was it the policy of persecution and repression, and particularly the persecution of the Jews? So there's so many things that he could be seen as culpable of, and there was no agreement on it. And let's just take the armistice. For the American government, Vichy was a legal entity. Right. America had an ambassador at Vichy until April April 1942. And Vichy was recognized by most countries in the world. So it's a pretty odd to put someone on trial for a government which was recognized by Roosevelt and most other countries, at least until November 1942. So I think de Gaulle's argument is necessary if you're de Gaulle, but it's not actually, it doesn't really hold water, probably, because Vichy had legality. And that word legality was contrasted by de Gaulle, who knew he was on thin ice. So he developed an alternative notion called legitimacy. So he said Pétain may have been legal, though some people tried to claim he wasn't, but he wasn't legitimate. But then what is a legitimate government? Well, for de Gaulle, legitimacy meant that as long as you had German troops on French soil and the Vichy government was a kind of puppet, it couldn't be called legitimate. But a government which is approved by probably 95% of the population, if you'd had a vote, which is recognized by Roosevelt, which is recognized by the Vatican, which is recognized by the Soviet Union until 1941, it's pretty legitimate, it seems to me. So the problem is, what is he guilty of? And part of the problem with the trial, and why I found the trial such a fascinating, I think trials are fascinating in themselves, but actually this trial, and I wanted to call it the trial of the century originally, but one of my colleagues said, oh, what about O.J. Simpson and all the other trials there have been? So I said, okay, fair enough. Let's not call it that. And so we came with France on trial. But for me, the fascination of it is in 3 weeks in a courtroom, you have all these questions discussed. It's like a long 3-week immediate history lesson in which there are big philosophical and ethical questions and legal questions, moral questions, and judicial questions which are at stake.
Yeah, we had a great conversation with Michael Nyberg early in the course of School of War about his excellent book on the very complicated American
Great book.
Policy debates and the policy approach to Vichy, which is really unexplored terrain for me, and I think most people. I do, I confessed already I'm sort of sympathetic to the de Gaulle view, and I'm not at all immersed in the legal niceties here, and everything you say seems pretty persuasive on that front. But I'm enough of an unreconstructed Winston Churchill fan for all the just normal, superficial, basic reasons that I can't think of this question of the armistice without thinking of Churchill's speech right around this time, right? It's right at the fall of France.
Yeah, just on that. I basically, we're on the same page. I mean, I'm with you on this.
Sure.
I wrote an 800-page book on de Gaulle, which is essentially favorable, but rather interestingly, Churchill obviously denounced the armistice in 1940, sorry. But at Pétain's trial, one of the defenders of Pétain, one of the lawyers defending him, produced a quote from Churchill, something that Churchill had said in beginning of 1944, when he was in a because Churchill had bouts of major irritation against de Gaulle, as most people did, and he was in a particularly bad mood against de Gaulle, and he said to another general, Georges, doesn't matter who he is, actually, the armistice helped us. In looking back on it, the armistice helped us. And one of the arguments of the Vichy defenders at the trial was, and this may seem bizarre, that actually the armistice had helped the Americans and the British in this way. Roosevelt was always hoping to pull Vichy into the Allied camp. It never happened.
Right.
It was a judgment. And after the war, an American historian, Walter Langer, wrote a book called Our Vichy Gamble. They gambled on Vichy and it didn't work. And somebody reviewed the book and said it should have been called Our Vichy Fumble, because it was a failed policy, I think. But it was a rational policy up to a point. But in 1942, when Torch happened, and Vichy did actually fire on the Americans, but soon the Americans won and so on. And at that point, the argument of the Vichy defenders is, had there been Germans in North Africa, it would have been a much tougher game for the Allies. And although we did fire on them a bit, yeah, but just for show. But very quickly, the Americans were able. So it was thanks to us that Operation Torch could happen, because the armistice kept that bit of France out of German hands. That is, I know you're looking very skeptical, and obviously it's nonsense. It's nonsense, but it's not complete nonsense. It wasn't the intention. But let's see what happened in Tunisia. The French, Vichy did allow the Germans into Tunisia at that moment, and it took months for the Allies actually to clear Tunisia, if you want, of the Axis. So obviously that was not the intention. It was an unintended consequence. But nonetheless, so when Churchill made that statement, he was in a bad mood about de Gaulle, but he wasn't saying something completely without some foundation somewhere. Douglas Porch, I don't know, a fine American historian, very fine, who's has written about the French army and the war, and a great book on the war in the Mediterranean. He thinks that actually, the Tunisian campaign, where the Germans really held back the Allies for 6 weeks, was crucial in the defeat of Germany. So if the Germans had actually been in Morocco and Algeria and Tunisia, the war would have been won by the Allies, but nonetheless, it's not completely without foundation, even if it was certainly not in the intention of the Vichy regime to help the Allies.
I don't want to get too sidetracked on de Gaulle, but your remarks put me in mind of an episode. You'll no doubt know this from your own research and probably correct some of the details, but I was just reading Lucien Truscott's memoir of his service as ultimately he's promoted in retirement to a 4-star general, but his service in North Africa and Europe in the Second World War. And he describes a scene which I guess is it must be the summer of 1942, or spring summer of 1942, where he's sitting with General Eisenhower, who at that point is, on his rapid rise to supreme command. And Truscott is a young officer performing a staff role there in London. And de Gaulle all but bursts into the office and says essentially he's got wind of the planning for Operation Torch. And I can't remember exactly. It's something like, and I assume I'll be in command, or I assume, French officers will be in command, or something like that. And so this figure who's very much on his, just on this theme of how Churchill was habitually irritated, which seems to have been an endemic condition. This man who's on his way to being this grand historical titan frequently comes off as, in this moment, in this scene in the memoir, it's just preposterous. It's this absurd encounter. Before de Gaulle stalks back off again. Yeah, no, that sounds too. I didn't know that particular incident, but that sounds completely plausible. Yeah. Yeah. No, but I just we can move on. But I the Churchill speech I have in mind. Of course, the famous the Battle of France is over. The Battle of Britain has begun right from this moment. And Churchill's own sort of strategic outline for Parliament that memorably will fight them on the beaches, etc. But his point is, if all that fails, then we have the empire in the New World, and there is a British Empire, and there was a French Empire. There was a French Empire, there was a French Navy, there were these assets that were yet undefeated. But I think we probably agree more than we disagree here. I am curious on this question of the sort of progress, or maybe the devolution of Vichy from this entity, this apparently more or less sovereign entity from afar, that the Americans can actually think, oh, maybe we'll bring them over to our side somehow. We'll figure out how to cooperate with them as things get tenser and tenser with the Nazis. So that's sort of 1940 to this transition after the photograph and the announcement of this policy of collaboration by Pétain, then all the way obviously to 42, and kind of things move into a completely new phase. Just talk about Vichy. What was its structure? Who were the other major personalities like Laval and others? How did this thing function, and how did it sort of its inner truth, which was that it was always a bit of a puppet, right? How did that sort of reveal itself?
It was a bit of a puppet, and it was a dictatorship, but it was a pluralistic dictatorship, like lots of dictatorships. That's to say, it wasn't fascist. I don't think it was. But there were fascists there. It wasn't a conservative Catholic dictatorship, but there were conservative Catholics there. It was a bit of everything against the old left. That was probably did create a sort of cement of unity. And I think the other thing that held them all together, the key figures of Vichy really are Pétain is the man at the top, and at the trial there was a lot of discussion to extent to which Pétain was responsible for his actions. Was he actually, he was an old man, he was in his 80s, was he actually losing his mind? Was he being manipulated? And that was key at the trial, because you had this, he refused to answer wisely. His lawyers said, better not, you keep quiet, because he'd get confused about dates and so on. You'll make a declaration and then you'll just sit quiet. And so people would see during the 3 weeks of the trial this old man sort of slumped in his chair, sometimes falling asleep, and quite justifiably, because a lot of it was very boring. And it was very hot. And people, a lot of journalists were fascinated. What's going on in his head? Does he know what's going on? Sometimes he pretended to be deafer than he was. He'd sometimes cup his hand behind his ear. So there was a lot of fascination about how much was he actually responsible for his actions, or was he just the puppet of others? And I think my answer to that would be, yeah, he was an old man, and later, by the time he was in prison, he certainly was in the early stages of Alzheimer's. But I think in 1940 to 45, he was an old man, but he was in control. But the key figures were, first, the man who everybody thought was the kind of evil genius of Pétain and of Vichy, Pierre Laval, a former politician, the epitome of the compromising, slightly Machiavellian, louche politician and so on. And Laval had really one conviction, which was that Germans had won the war. And if you may not like them, you may not like the fact, but they've won. And you do a deal with the winner. And he went on really thinking this well into, and it wasn't an absurd thing to think, at least until the Battle of Stalingrad. By the end of 1942, it was getting pretty blind to think the Germans were going to win the war. But by then, there's no way back anyway, so you might as well stay with it. So that was Laval's position. And the other big, strong man of Vichy was the Admiral Darlan. And Darlan was a man who hadn't actually been on the right in the interwar years. He had the usual Anglophobia of French naval officers. And something we haven't mentioned, but is terribly important in public opinion and in Vichy in this period, was that Churchill, who could not take the risk after the signing of the armistice that the French fleet would fall into the hands of the Germans, took the, I think, morally courageous but very difficult decision to basically say to the French fleet in North Africa that either, as it were, they rally the Allies, or they will be attacked. And so the attack on the French fleet at Mers el Kebir in North Africa, when 1,200 French sailors are killed by the British, and that's the fact, is something which really still the French remember today, actually. And so for Darlan, that was an act of unbelievable treachery, because he said, I would never have given my fleet up to the Germans, which may or not have been true, but Churchill couldn't take the risk. I completely see that. So Darlan was motivated by Anglophobia and opportunism. Again, Germany's won the war, so let's do a deal. Let's be pragmatic. The problem with this whole idea of collaboration, so Germany's won the war, so let's collaborate with Germany. Let's do a deal. Let's try and prepare ourselves to get the best possible peace treaty when the war is over. And they thought they were being really hard-headed, and I suppose they were being hard-headed, except they got the call wrong, so to speak. But it has to be said that the call they were making suited their own politics, because they also saw this as an opportunity, as we said at the beginning, for an internal national revolution to remake France and so on. So those are the key figures. Gravitating around them are all kind of more extremist figures, what we would really call French fascists. For example, there was a group that called the Legion of Volunteers Against Bolshevism, who after Germany attacked the Soviet Union in 1941, so the communists now become the enemy. Some French wanted to go and fight with the Germans against the communist enemy, Bolshevism, on the Eastern Front. And that wasn't the official policy of Vichy, but it has to be said, one thing at the trial that really, there were 24 jurors at Pétain's trial, and some of them were really thinking about, what do we think? And one of them I used his diary because it happened to be a source which has come available. And what we see him thinking is, I could see I could see why Pétain did this, I could see what, but how can we forgive a Marshal of France who said, as Pétain did, as the members of this organization, the Legion of Volunteers Against Bolshevism, head off, they're not many of them, they're fanatics, you are taking something like, you are carrying a part of the honor of France. How can a Marshal of France, this juror said, support Frenchmen who are going to fight with Germans, even if it's against Bolshevism? So Vichy's a really complicated thing. Those are the key figures, and gravitating around, they're much more extreme and much more sinister people than Pétain, Laval, and Darlan.
If you ask anyone today, what are the crimes of the Vichy regime? I mean, obviously, just collaboration with the Germans against the French people and all of the victims of France who were resisting the Nazis. That's obviously something that people will know. The other thing that they'll know and they'll say is, of course, as you put it, the persecution of the Jews, in which Vichy is. You'll probably know the numbers better than me. This is the fruit of a few minutes of internet research. But if you narrowed it down to just Jews rounded up and almost all of them ultimately murdered in Vichy, under the control of Vichy, the number is something like 10,000. Obviously, the number for France as a whole is much greater. But even 10,000 is it's pretty big as mass murder goes. One of the fascinating aspects of the trial, which you spent a fair amount of time reflecting on, is that this is not a major theme of the trial at all, which is sort of a reminder of just how much discussion of and knowledge of the Holocaust is sort of a later phenomenon, not a 1945 phenomenon. Talk a bit about Vichy's attitude towards the Jews, both in terms of being servants of Nazi policy, but their own attitudes.
Well, that's a massively important question, and I have a chapter called "The Absent Jews," because there was of all the things Pétain was being accused of. The Jewish question was never not there, but it was certainly not a primary importance. So basically what happened was that Vichy, from the very beginning, was an anti-Semitic regime. But there's a difference between being anti-Semitic and murdering Jews. It was anti-Semitic in this sense, that when it came to power, without any German pressure, one of the first acts of the regime was to set up various forms of discrimination against Jews. Let's just mention the most important, the Jewish Statute, October 1940, so 40, very early on. No German pressure. And that basically excluded Jews from a whole series of professions, French Jews and foreign Jews, from being doctors, lawyers, whatever. So you're starting to discriminate against Jews, and that is going on throughout, and there's pressure. But and foreign Jews, that's to say Jews who, why are foreign Jews in France? Well, they could be German refugees who'd come in the 1930s and so on. So there are lots of Jews in France who aren't actually French citizens, who are just there because France had been seen as a territory of asylum in the 30s, are put into internment camps. And again, they're not treated well, but they're not being exterminated or anything. But so there's Vichy, well, let's call it exclusionary anti-Semitism. And then from 1942, there's what you might call German exterminatory anti-Semitism, when from beginning of 42, the Germans are starting to round up Jews throughout Europe for deportation, for extermination. And in July 1942, the head of Vichy government and his head of police, a man called Bousquet, do a deal with the Germans and basically say, right, you want Jews for deportation. Nobody was sort of saying, it was all being said, well, they're being deported to places in Eastern Europe where there could be a Jewish, they'll be working on farms. So no, the word extermination is obviously never used. And one of the defenses afterwards was, well, we didn't really know what was going to happen to them, but they didn't really ask what was going to happen to them, or they didn't really care what was going to happen to them. But they didn't probably know. But so the deal is done. Okay, you want Jews to be rounded up. We're an autonomous government. Our help is necessary. So the deal, I'm simplifying hugely, the deal is we will allow the French police to be involved in this, but the French police will only arrest foreign Jews. Only foreign Jews, that's to say Jews who are not French citizens, will be arrested and deported, but not French Jews. And that's the deal. And that's the deal. It's what you might call the fatal moment in the history of Vichy. And it's what a French historian said to me the other day, actually, we were talking about this. He said that deal transformed a German crime into a French crime, which puts it actually very neatly. So, but what has to be said is that deal was motivated by collaboration, not by anti-Semitism. Let's say the French regime wouldn't have itself voluntarily inaugurated a policy of extermination, but as a chance of getting proper control over its police, which was part of the deal. So you give us back control of police and we'll lend the police for this operation. It was willing, as it were, to sacrifice foreign Jews. Now, at the trial and afterwards, and indeed very recently, I've even been involved in a court case which is happening in France this week, I think, or next week. One of the arguments of the defenders of Vichy was Vichy, yes, it was terrible, but reluctantly it had taken the grave decision to sacrifice foreign Jews, but to save French Jews. At least it could do that. And that argument is still brought out. You've probably heard of the extreme right French politician today, Eric Zemmour. Mm-hmm. And that is the argument that Zemmour uses today. He says, Vichy France protected French Jews. So that's the sort of, and the numbers, by the way, the total number of Jews deported from France was 75,000, deported and who didn't come back, 75,000. And what is interesting is there's no doubt that the proportion of French Jews who died was much smaller. I can't remember offhand. So the majority were Jews not French nationality. And overall, the proportion of French Jews, of Jews from France who were deported and exterminated was much lower than it was from Holland or Belgium. And that's again used by the defenders of Vichy to say that without Vichy it would have all been worse. Obviously, Belgium and Holland are very small countries where the geography of France matters. There are lots of other factors. But that's the basic outline. Now, none of this was much talked about at the trial. The extent to which it was, the argument was put that the deportations were a German policy. That kept being said by the defenders. And Vichy did its best to put in restraints, the kind I've described. And it has to be said that argument did weigh with people because they didn't see it in the way I've just described it because they didn't have all the archival evidence we now have. Remember, the trial's happening weeks after it's all over. They don't have all the documents we now have. But what's fascinating is one of the 24 jurors in the trial, when it came to the discussions as to whether Pétain what should happen to Pétain, should he get the death penalty? This man called Georges Alphonse Lévy, he was the oldest juror. He was a former parliamentarian, MP. He was from Alsace, and he was Jewish. Alsace being part of France, it was annexed, it's been between the Germans and the French. So he said, as it was being discussed, he said, my view is that as an Alsacien, I would vote for the death penalty because Pétain did nothing to protest against the effective annexation of where I come from by the Germans. That's an act of, that in itself for me is treason. But as a Jew, I wouldn't vote for the death penalty because I think he did his best to protect the Jews. So, which is fascinating as an example of the extent to which that argument at the time did obviously have some traction. But the overall story is what you said a few minutes ago, which is in the end, the Jewish issue in 1945 was not the one that most people were thinking about because, as you again rightly said, the Holocaust, which has now become, as it were, one of the sort of defining crimes, whatever, of the 20th century, was not seen like that. It wasn't actually at Nuremberg the main issue. The main issue in Nuremberg was that the Nazis were responsible for having caused the war. Even in the early days of Israel, actually, Holocaust survivors were not particularly welcome. Nobody really wanted to talk about the Holocaust. So what we might call the specificity of the Holocaust. That's to say that the people, why do I use the word specificity? Because there was a lot of sympathy in France in 1945 for the people who came back from concentration camps. They were called the déportés, the deported, come back. And they're often skeletal, they're in the striped pajama, all the images we all have of the concentration camps. But they included, in the French case, lots of resistors who weren't Jews. And nobody made any distinction, particularly between the Jews who, not many Jews came back, but those Jews who had come back and the other déportés. Everybody, all déportés were the same. So the specificity of the German plans towards the Jews, which we call the Holocaust and the French call the Shoah, wasn't really seen. So it wasn't the big issue. And my final point there is France in 1945 wasn't without, in 45, anti-Semitism. Right. A lot of Jewish families a lot of French families who had, in good faith probably, bought property or taken over properties and in the war, which had been expropriated from Jews, found themselves in a situation where some of those Jews who did return, let me give you an example. I don't know if you've read that one of the great French hero today, last week, was sent to was buried in the Pantheon, which is where the French bury their great men from Victor Hugo on. Robert Badinter, a great lawyer who had been Minister of Justice under Vichy. He was responsible for the abolition of the death penalty under Minister Mitterrand, who in 1981, Badinter as his Minister of Justice, abolished the death penalty, abolished discrimination against gays, a great moral figure. Badinter was the son of Jewish parents. His father died in Auschwitz, but he, as a boy in 1945, and with his mother, he went to try and get back possession. I mean, his mother went and he went as a boy, the first time he'd been in a court, to see his mother trying to argue that they could get their flat back, and they didn't, because these defenders' flats said we bought them in good faith. And so there were even anti-Jewish league sort of housing associations in Paris in 1945, May and June, saying, we should be allowed to stay on. We were good patriots. Actually, we kept those flats out of the hands of the Germans. So the whole Jewish thing is very complicated. And I think the key thing is it wasn't central for a lot of reasons. And that's not just the case of France.
So just one more question on this subject, because there's something I don't understand here, which is you have this deal to protect French Jews in Vichy, which seems, based on the numbers, to have had some effect. Though, again, just to make the important point, as a purely exculpatory matter, it seems to leave a lot wanting.
Well, no,
nevertheless, I know you agree.
No, it's morally a very problematic argument.
Of course, but
I'm
just trying to understand the structure of this, because I don't understand the architecture of the annihilationist plan. So you have this deal. When I think of, though, the roundups is it the summer of 42 that you have the roundups in Paris that go to Drancy and then almost everyone's killed at Auschwitz? There's a lot of French. So is it, if you're French in the occupied zone, that's where you're really at risk and you have somewhat better chances in Vichy throughout the war, and then when Vichy's occupied, you're all at risk? Or how does it actually work?
The deal was so the French Jews in the occupied zone where there were Germans were not arrested either in this period.
I see.
Because the French, but what the real key crime, I mean, obviously this is a crime. The French, when the deal was signed, they said, we will use our police also to arrest foreign Jews in the non-occupied area. So they went into Jews were rounded up by the French police in both the occupied zone and the unoccupied zone, but these were foreign Jews. Later on, that unraveled for all kinds of reasons, and French Jews start to be deported and so on. And I don't want to.
I was trying to understand, because I know that happened.
I take your point. I don't want to fixate too much on it, because for you, as you say, as an exculpatory argument, it has very little traction. Sure. The only reason I mention it is to the extent that there's a Vichyist legacy today, the extent to which people try to sort of find something to defend. And Zemmour is not a mainstream, he got 7% at the last presidential election in France. So he's not nothing, that's probably 1.5 million votes or something. And obviously his platform isn't, I want to bring Vichy back. But one of the things he's been quite well known for is relentlessly arguing for the fact that Vichy, people go on about how awful Vichy was, he said, but actually what Vichy did was to protect French Jews, and he'll sort of say, oh, of course, that was it's terrible that foreign Jews died, but at least it tried to protect its French citizens. What he's doing this for, and I would say, is to prepare the ground, as it were, psychologically, if you want, politically, for saying, well, so Vichy was perfectly entitled to. He's trying to distance Vichy from extermination, right? In order to rehabilitate the Vichy of discrimination. Because what he wants to do is basically to do to, I mean, I'm putting it very simply, to do to Muslims what Vichy did to Jews. I mean, that's it's quite clear that's his plan, as it were. And but therefore you first have to show that Vichy wasn't guilty of the crime that, is nobody's going to defend. And so that his argument is, well, Vichy reluctantly, and it wasn't reluctant at all. Laval was only too delighted to have the French police arresting what he called the déchets, the sort of rubbish of the French Jews, of the foreign Jews, of the refugees, and an example of how they actually didn't really care would be this: that a lot of, technically, if you're born on French soil, you are French. So some of these foreign Jews who had arrived as refugees, right, in the 30s, their children had been born in France, so were French, but those children all went with their parents. So if you really care about your citizens, well, you start to make those kinds of discriminations. So 3,000 children who were roughly, 3,000 children who were the children of refugees, very small children who had been born in France, who were therefore technically French, died along with their parents. So I'm only, in a sense, we're talking about a trial here, and the trials are about prosecution and defense. And everything I'm saying here is to show you one of the arguments used for the defense. In no way am I the spokesman, I hope, for this.
No, not at all. No. And I hope I'm not implying that you are.
No, I don't think you are. No.
That's quite clear. So Vichy goes through these stages. There's this period where it's actually kind of unclear what the nature of this regime is. It seems maybe it is a bit sovereign. Then there's the explicit policy of collaboration. And then things do just sort of start to fall apart. 43, Pétain tries to assert himself a bit and oust Laval. It doesn't work out for him at all. The Nazis assert themselves. And then, of course, in 44, as it really is falling apart, he's bundled off to Germany by the Nazis. Evaluate, just for Pétain personally, just this is sort of to the Raymond Aron point, but there seem to be numerous points at which, even if you could persuade yourself in 40, 41 that you were doing the least worst thing, clearly at some point you're out of room to maneuver here. You have no agency, and the Nazis are just you are their servant. Why does he stick with it virtually until he's put under arrest in 44 by the Germans?
No, that is a very good question to which I'm not sure I know the answer. I think that by end of 1943, Vichy has become simply a total puppet. It's a rump state. It's a semi-fascist state. There's no rule of any kind of law at all. So yeah, there's a sort of simmering civil war, and Vichy is. Everybody knows that Vichy is at its end. And I suppose that I turn the question back. What else could Pétain? I think by then, the only thing he could do would be to stick with the policy as claiming that to the end he was trying to be the sort of protector of the French people against the war. It was always this idea: there's a war going on around us, but we are sort of, I'm trying to hide you, protect you from it. Let's give an example, a specific example of that. Even in 1944, when nobody has any illusions, he gets a sort of recovery of popularity among the French people, who are by now hate Vichy. There's no question, but there's always a kind of double think with the French population this time, that Pétain possibly, like the king and the evil councillors, with a traditional idea that the king isn't responsible, it's his evil councillors. With Pétain, is it Laval? And he starts to visit cities that have been bombed by the Allies in preparation for or during D-Day, and he sort of goes to them, and he's seen, and he's the sort of grandfather of the people who's sharing their suffering and so on. And I think that was the only card he had left to play, the card of saying I was wrong all along. That it was too late. I mean, that you couldn't say that. That isn't a defense. So I think he was just playing that card to the end, and I think believed in an extraordinary way that de Gaulle would sort of see. One of his advisors even produced a letter that was to be taken to de Gaulle to say, I've done my best to protect France for 4 years. Now I hand over to you. We've both done our role. I tried to protect from best I could. Went a bit wrong at the end. You were the liberator from outside. I hand over power to you. And de Gaulle refused to even meet this person. He said, I am not accepting a transfer responsibility from an illegal and illegitimate government which has never been France. So Pétain, I think, was living a kind of sad delusion, really. And I mean, one question I've asked myself, and people ask me often when I talk about the trial, about my book at various occasions, they always say, because I think as you reminded listeners at the beginning, when the trials opened, Pétain wasn't even in France. Pétain had been kidnapped, literally kidnapped by the Germans at the very end. And he was in this sort of weird, sort of Disney-like castle of Sigmaringen in Baden-Baden on the river Danube. And the whole, the rump of Vichy was sort of in this gilded cage, this castle. So he wasn't, as it becomes clear, that everything's over, most of the others try to escape somewhere or other. Escape. Many of them, not many, but some go into hiding. Some get to Spain, to Franco's Spain. So quite a lot of former Vichy people end up in Franco's Spain. Laval got to Spain, for example, but was extradited by the Allies. But others stayed in Spain. But Pétain didn't. Pétain said it was quite clear he wanted to go back to France to face the people. And de Gaulle, there's the last thing de Gaulle wanted.
Right.
De Gaulle was really hoping, because he knew that the complexity of the relationship that the French people had to Pétain, he knew that they see him as a traitor, but it's complicated. So de Gaulle knew that a trial of Pétain would be to some extent divisive. So he's rather hoping Pétain would take refuge in Switzerland, stay in Switzerland, keep out of trouble. There would be a trial in absentia, and everything could go back not to normal, but that would deal with the situation. But Pétain wasn't having anything of it. He got into Switzerland, and he then crossed Switzerland, and to the relief of the Swiss authorities, presented himself at the French frontier to meet the French people. Now, you could say that was an act of courage, or you could say an act of lunacy, or senility, or whatever. And I don't know. And I think he had been living for 4 years in a bubble of adulation, in a bubble. All courts are like that. Vichy was a kind of court, and you're already told. You're told, people tell you what you want to hear. When he would go, everything was choreographed. When he went on, meetings, there would always be people there to cheer him and so on. So he was kind of half believed his own propaganda. And I think the moment of truth came when a train met him at the Swiss frontier to take him back to Paris, where he was put in a prison awaiting the preparation of the trial. And as the train set off, there was a sort of crowd of demonstrators assembled and started pelting it with rocks and stones and so on. And Pétain's and Pétain's wife said, "Oh, are they going to kill us?" and so on. He's with his wife the whole time, and I think that's the moment, in my view, when he possibly had the same sort of doubts that Louis XVI, who headed famously to the frontier at Varennes in 1791, was brought back by the French people. Was captured, as it were, just as he was trying to escape. It's different. He was trying to escape and was brought back, and Pétain was coming back. But in both cases, as they went back to Paris, they must have both thought, well, this isn't going to be good. But it was too late. He'd made the decision. So I mean, that is, in the end, the question is a question of psychology. It's a question which a novelist might try to answer. But my stab at an answer is that somewhere he did believe in himself. He believed he was a patriot. He believed he'd done his best.
I'm no apologist for the French monarchy. It does strike me that Louis XVI's crimes were substantially less than Pétain's, and it's such a striking. I don't even want to use the word tragic, but it's a grim and squalid end.
No, I agree. I was using the comparison almost just. I think of the two. No, I just think of the two. I just think of the two journeys. As you're going back, you know what's at the end of the line, and there must have been a lot of thinking about about it all and so on.
Of course. And as you point out, the French right, the French right themselves, they sort of the Pétain, or maybe the Pétainist right, is to be more specific.
Yeah.
They sort of draw out that analogy to Louis XVI. The idea being that both persecutions are unjust. And the last question I want to ask you is. You close the book on kind of a definitive note, pointing out that Zemmour, who we spent a fair amount of time talking about, he ends up getting single-digit percent of the vote, whereas Marine Le Pen, of course, daughter of a right-wing French politician who very much sort of embraced Pétainism and the legacy of Pétain, Marine Le Pen sort of repositioning her party in more of a Gaullist or de Gaullist, either way, sort of interpretation of French right-wing politics and efforts at coalition building. And she, of course, did historically well in the last round. And you've sort of closed this book with the assertion that the trial's over, the case is closed, and actually Pétainism is a weaker force perhaps now. I sit here in the United States. We have all kinds of complicated efforts to reinterpret the Second World War on what I will describe as the podcast right. Most of them, in bad faith or rooted in appalling misrepresentation of facts, emphasizing some things, de-emphasizing others. So I was struck. I guess what I'm trying to say is I was struck by how optimistic the end of your book was.
No, that's completely wrong.
Okay.
No, and I don't blame you for that. So many people said the same to me after that.
Oh, okay.
Book came out.
I feel better then.
No. So I changed the end in French.
Okay.
Because only about 5 lines. The last line of the book is the Pétain case is over, or the Pétain trial's over, something like that, for the reasons you just said. But what I meant by that was, and you've sort of, in your lead up to the question, you've sort of unpicked what I meant, which is, what I meant to say was that really, apart from a few ultras like Zemmour, nobody really tries to defend Pétain, because the case against him now seems so clearly definitive that actually there's no mileage, there are no votes in Pétain. But my point was, and the way I changed the end in French, I said the Pétain trial is now over, but Pétainism is alive and well in France. Also, I didn't quite use those words, by which I meant that extreme right ideas, and it's a bit simplistic to say Pétainism, but a certain kind of right-wing nationalist exclusionism against racial minorities, authoritarian ideas, anti-liberalism, all these things are unfortunately not just in France, but very strong in France, and perfectly incarnated by the Rassemblement National, which is the new name of the National Front, the party of Marine Le Pen. But my point is that where her father would actually go and put flowers on Pétain's tomb, and was unreconstructed in his defense of Vichy and also actually in his anti-Semitism. She, whatever she thinks, I'm not in her head, so I don't know, but she was certainly brought up in that sort of environment. But she's cleverly realized that there are no votes in that. So her policy has been to detoxify, as that's the term she uses, to detoxify the brand, if you want, by disassociating it from Vichy, and Zemmour's attempt to rehabilitate Vichy shows she's right, because okay, got him 7%, but that's not going to get you elected. But so she uses the language of Gaullism, absolutely. She now, whereas her father hated de Gaulle, she now, like everybody, says how wonderful de Gaulle was and so on. But what's worrying is that, what we mustn't think, however, is that the ideas in mutated form, which Vichy at one stage incarnated, are dead. I think they're very alive in different form. Obviously, I don't think the national. The Rassemblement National is actually anti-Semitic now, or mostly not, though on its fringes it is. But my point, when I said the trial was over, I meant that if you want to succeed as an extreme right politician and push what we could call, in rather simplistic terms, neo-Pétainist ideas, then you don't invoke the trial. You pretend the trial's over and you dress up those ideas in a different way. So that's so I'm glad I've had a chance not to be optimistic, because I'm very pessimistic about the state of France, but at least I'm optimistic about historical truth in the case of the trial.
Got it. Well, I hadn't realized my mistake.
Right.
I'm glad you had the opportunity to explain it there. And Julian Jackson, it really is an excellent book. I not only profited from reading it in the sense that I learned a lot. I enjoyed reading it. It's well written and spirited, and I recommend it to listeners. It's called France on Trial: The Case of Marshal Pétain. And Julian, thank you so much for spending all this time with us today.
It's a pleasure. Thank you very much for having me.
This is a Nebulous Media production. Find us wherever you get your podcasts.